So it's a great pleasure to introduce Davide Panagia, who is a professor of political science at UCLA, where he teaches political theory. And yes, I think I should add this piece of information that you were one of the former co-editor of the journal Political Theory.
Gladly former.
Yeah. I think there are other co-editors in the room.
Oh, exactly.
Yeah. So Davide's research focuses on aesthetic and politics, and is the author of many books. His first book is The Poetics of Political Thinking. And basically the book focuses on the role that aesthetic sensibilities play in theorists' evaluations of political arguments. The second book, The Political Life of a Sensation, was published by Duke University Press in 2009. Impressions of You, 2013. 10 Theses for an Aesthetics of Politics, University of Minnesota Press, 2016. A book on Rancière Sentiments, Duke University Press, 2018. And recently, in 2024, I don't know how he could make it, while he was the chair of the department and co-editor of political theory, he was able to produce other two new books. One is Intermedialities, Political Theory and Cinematic Experience, Northwestern University Press, and Sentimental Empiricism, Politics, Philosophy, and Criticism in Post-War France, Fordham University Press. Today is presenting a paper whose title is Political Theory, Democracy, and the Challenges of Algorithmic Governance. You have the floor, and please.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming and for this invitation. This is my first time at Santa Cruz, believe it or not. So I'm actually very happy to be here because it's such a beautiful part of the world and not urban. So instead of reading a detailed talk and paper, I thought that I would sort of talk through some of the issues that I find. That hence the more general title of the talk. Talk through some of the issues that I'm trying to work out in relationship to the role that algorithms have in our daily life, and how these are challenges to democracy, but also to and especially for the nature of this new project that I'm hoping to be able to start writing at some point, rather than writing around it. I think they raise important challenges to our histories, in terms of the History of Consciousness program, our histories of critical thinking. I think that we're in a situation right now where, as it has happened several times in the past, certainly in the modern period, we're having to rethink our sort of critical theories, critical attachments, forms of critical engagement in relationship to the emergence of technical media that present certain challenges and opportunities in terms of the kinds of claims that they make upon us. So I'm going to try to unpack, before I get to the nuts and bolts of my talk, what I want to try and do is unpack where I'm coming from. So when I talk about algorithmic governance in the title, I don't mean how we govern algorithms, but which is usually what the term intends, but how it is that we understand the governance of algorithms in our everyday lives, right? So how are these systems of governance? So that's the first point of clarification. The second point of clarification is, unlike a lot of and you'll notice this throughout what I have to say, unlike the position of a lot of work in critical algorithm studies that I see available, and I see my friend and colleague Ira Allen has joined from Arizona, who's somebody I speak with often, and we're constantly exchanging around these issues, and he's written as well quite brilliantly on these topics. What I do not do is take the position of the standard sort of position of objectification and constraint and domination of algorithms. I don't think that that's a particularly productive direction to go in, even though everybody sort of goes in that direction. And the reason why that's the case, and this is to me one of the fundamental changes that you get between more traditional media, I'm thinking about literature, literary media, photography, and cinema, if we can, is that there isn't a system of constraint in place with algorithms in the way in which there is in more traditional media. What do I mean by this? Well, if we take something like the interpolation scenario of Althusser, where he wants to say that ideology is a form of limitation on movement, right? The "hey, you there" stops me in my tracks and somehow is a form of constraint. If we take traditional negative accounts of freedom, liberal accounts of freedom, negative liberty accounts of freedom that understand limitation and constraints as a form of physical impediment towards movement, we are dealing with a system that wants to do anything but constrain human movement. And this to me is a fundamental difference in terms of what it is that we're dealing with. This is not a system that tries to prevent us from doing anything, that tries to constrain us from doing anything. And here I'm talking mostly about predictive analytics. I'm going to reify the term algorithms, and I apologize for that, but it's just for the sake of clarity, or the sake of ease, at least for this talk. But I will give an example in just a little while of the kind of algorithm that has captured my attention. In other words, what I want to say is that, within the world of algorithmic governance, democracy exists, is having to deal with a technical medium that is completely anathema to our understandings of constraint. Quite the contrary. Data requires constant movement. If we all stop moving, if we all stop saying something, and we all stop breathing, we all stop, there would be no data. Why? Because data is the differential between 2 points, right? Between point A and point B, between the distance between my eyes, et cetera, et cetera. These are measurements that measure points, in space and time, measure differences, right? In space and time. And so the fact of algorithms exists because there is constant movement. And so many of our critical theories and critical ideas, especially coming from the modern tradition after Hobbes, after Kant, after Rousseau, after Marx, tend to focus on, obviously, domination and constraint. But what do you do with a system of governance that is quite the opposite, that in fact doesn't want to constrain anything? And what kind of critical apparatus is available? Now, I don't want to say that there aren't a whole series of problems, right, that have to do with surveillance, that have to do with policing, that have to do with racial bias and algorithms and all these sorts of things that we all know about, right? But there, the concerns that I see being expressed in the literature has much more to do with the human uses of technology than it does have to do, and it's always been the human use of technology, rather than what the kinds of claims that the technology can make upon us. And so the approach that I try to take is much more oriented towards the kinds of work that somebody like, Benjamin does, the kinds of work that somebody like Stanley Cavell does, that is interested in the technical operations of media and tries to understand how it is that these create not so much constraints, but new ways of arranging and perceiving the world. Here I'm thinking about especially Cavell's work on cinema, which has always been very, very influential. And I'm also interested in saying that, whatever he has to say content-wise about cinema, or whatever we can say about other technical media, it's very difficult to be able to say the same thing about algorithms. The reason why it's difficult, and this is a second major premise that I try to develop in the work that I'm sort of presenting today, but really in the general project, is that what we're dealing with algorithms are technologies that are non-representational. They do not represent reality. The algorithm's logic is not the logic of this is X, this is a tree, this is a car, this is a person. The algorithm's logic is one of rendering, if then. One of the claims that I make, one of the sort of obscenely generalist claims that I make as this work proceeds forward, is that all of our ways of critical thinking are rooted in a history of mimesis, right? This is, or this is not. This could be not, et cetera, et cetera. When we enter the modern period, as Emily Nakel, Ian Hacking, and a whole series of other people that have paid attention to the rise of risk and probability thinking, and this is why ultimately the tradition of sentimental empiricism will become relevant in just a little while. As we move into the modern period, we enter into a world in which, yes, we still exist within the parameters, and democracies emerge within parameters of representational thinking and representations in general, right? Obviously. At exactly the same moment, probabilistic thinking and risk thinking emerge as central to how we govern and organize our lives. The determinism of the early modern period drops out, and we enter a world of probability and risk thinking. That world is one that renders outputs rather than representing reality. And that's the fundamental difference that I'm trying to explore in this project. What is critical thinking in a world governed by the rendering of an output as opposed to the representation of a reality? Because we have a lot of tools available to us as political thinkers, as cultural critics, that deal with the representations of reality. We have a lot of critical tools, but we really haven't spent that much time thinking about what critical thinking means and what are the critical tools available to us in relationship to probability and risk assessment, or to the rendering of outputs, where an output is not a representation of a reality. To give you an idea, and this is the point at which I hope I'm able to do what we spent half an hour trying to do. This is one of the things that sort of captures my attention and that I use as a very helpful tool. This is a website. What's that? Am I muted?
No, it's fine.
No, that is muted. I'm not muted. No. So this is a website that was devised, and it's been around for a while. It's entitled "This Person Does Not Exist," and the title of the website gives everything away. Just to give you now, I'm not a coder. I know nothing about this. My son, who's 15 years old, is learning to code in Python and knows a lot more about this than I do already. So, if I sound technical, it just means that I've, memorized it. I don't actually know it. So don't ask me any technical questions. But I do know that this is a style-GAN algorithm, and a style-GAN algorithm pits two forms of two systems of AI against each other that are competing in a sort of game theoretical model to generate, the most perfect kind of rendering given the parameters inserted. And so, you can consistently update it, and it gives you a whole different images, portraits, let's call them that, selfies, portraits, call them whatever you want. None of these people exist in the world. That's the point of the website, and the point of the difference between how we perceive and experience a digital image, right? We are not dealing with the representation of a person. We're not dealing, as in the case of portraiture, we're not dealing with the transcription of a person, as in the case of photochemical photography and cinema, right? What we are dealing with is the rendering of an output. And so the question to me is, if we can't say that this is an incorrect representation because it's a rendered output, what can we say critically about this experience and the nature of the technology and the nature of the image? So that is, I'm going to stop sharing now. That is at the heart of so these two aspects are two elements of the project. Let me just go to my paper. Sorry. I had called it up and then I closed it. Okay. The third sort of triumvirate of the project that I'm trying to work through is that, like it or not, the way in which we tend to think about media, at least in critical thinking, critical theories, and the humanities, very much rely on the notions of Aristotelian substances, right? A medium is a thing, and it does something. Usually, typically, what it does is it influences minds in some way, shape, or form, right? It has a form, and both form and matter. Here, I'm thinking exclusively of the way in which apparatus theory theorizes the lens in relationship to the gaze, right? A very, very strict one-to-one correspondence of tool and effects, cause and effects. We think in Aristotelian terms, again, in terms of causes and effects, right? And we effectively understand a medium as a unity of some kind. And here I'm thinking exclusively from Aristotle's Poetics. I do think, I mean, this is part of the one of the books that Max mentioned, the Intermedialities book, begins with this wanting to point out how dependent we are on an Aristotelian notion of media, even though Aristotle's Poetics doesn't give us an account of media, but you'll recall, for those of you who may have read it recently, how in the Poetics, especially towards the beginning of the Poetics, Aristotle first says, that tragedy is about the representation of action, and secondly says that a good work has a beginning, a middle, and an end. How do you know what a beginning is? It doesn't have an antecedent cause. How do you know what a middle is? It has an antecedent and a consequence. How do you know what an end is? Well, it doesn't have anything happening afterwards, right? So this, this classic kind of three-stage account of the play and subsequently of movies, the three-act play, and that a good work is one in which all the actions, fit together. In other words, it's a hylomorphic thing, right? And then he famously says, of the worst kinds of tragedies, or the worst kinds of plays, are episodic ones, because there is no causal relationship between actions, right? What I want to suggest is that, the challenge that we're dealing with in terms of algorithmic governance is that it's all episodic. The relation is not causal between the data points. We are living in a technical milieu that is wholly relational and non-causal. Which is exactly what probabilism and risk thinking allows for, right? It can't be teleological. Because if it's teleological, then it's deterministic. What an output is not a telos, but it's an one of many possibilities given the parameters that you outline as wanting to generate whatever output is possible. And so, as we know, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but we live in representational democracies. One person would vote, but the reality created by algorithms is a non-representational one. And so our conventional ways of thinking about politics and of thinking about ourselves, for that matter, are challenged by this new sort of technical orientation towards renderings, right? So where do we go from there? Well, it's, for those of you who know me, it's not a big surprise that instead of turning towards an Aristotelian and then a sort of modern kind of Kantian and Hegelian tradition, I'm much more inclined to turn towards the moral sentimental tradition. And for me, one of the sort of central figures is Hume, obviously, but not just Hume. The sort of, in contemporary sense, the way in which Deleuze picks up on Hume, et cetera, et cetera. And I can talk ad nauseum about that, but I won't go too much into it right now. But, why turn to Hume and the sentimental and sensationist tradition? Well, because the sentimental and sensationist tradition is one that is not exclusively concerned about power as domination, which, as I've suggested, is very difficult to sustain within this context of the particularities of this kind of technical system. Because the if-then logic isn't a logic of domination, it is a logic of arrangement. And so what I think is useful and helpful about the tradition of moral sentimentalism, or what I call sentimental empiricism, is that it understands the possibility of thinking critique in terms of relationality and not in terms of this is. But more importantly, it allows us to explore the idea of dispositional power rather than domination and constraint. And so what I want to do in this project in the end is make the argument or make the suggestion that that what we're dealing with when thinking about algorithmic governance from the perspective of a tradition of critical thinking is a system of dispositional powers that operates strangely like the sentiments. And here I do wish to sort of give you my sort of take on this as quickly as possible. Within the sentimental tradition, there are a couple of points that are worth keeping in mind. One is that the sentiments are not feelings, but they're forces of association and adjacency. Of course, they allow us to express effectively in the end pleasure or pain, right? But they are understood, the sentiments are understood as basically forces of attraction or separation. Sympathy as opposed to hate. So think of the sentiments as forces of relation. And secondly, and this is the classic sort of anti-Aristotelian move made by empiricists and sentimental empiricism, is that relations are not determined by the terms that they are relating. So within the teleological Aristotelian sort of substantialist Usiatic tradition that most of us live, right? Whether we like it or not, that most of us live. We tend to assume that X and Y are related in some kind of a fixed way. and in a necessary way, or causally necessary way. And obviously, we experience a whole series of challenges to that on an everyday basis, right? The family is this equation of male and female reproductive. Gender is this, all these sorts of things. Within the sentimental empiricist tradition, terms and relations are not fixed. In other words, relations between terms emerge out of a system of experience that isn't recognized, but is the result of, the happenstance of how things combine and occur with one another. So obviously, in Hume, the classic example of this is his account of the self, right? That, why was Hume considered the great infidel? Well, he was the great infidel because he basically showed us how humans don't have a soul, right? And so if you don't have a soul, there's no point to religion because you don't need salvation. And the reason why we don't have a soul is because the best we can do is to say that we are a bundle, to use the Anglo-American version, of impressions and experiences that changes sort of consistently. In other words, there's no fundamental cause that creates that relationship between matter and form that you get in Aristotle, but rather, and he does this very cleverly. We don't have personhood. We don't have self. What do we have instead is character. Right, character is the result of the character and reputation and all. That's why in the end something like habit is really important for him, because it's a form of repetition that is consistently being altered as a result of introducing new experiences. Right. In other words, what the sentimental empiricist tradition, as I understand it, introduces into the modern period is the idea that beliefs are revisable. And this is why, to me, turning towards a sentimental empiricist tradition is significant in terms of thinking about algorithms and trying to sort of develop critical strategies in relationship to algorithms. Because if beliefs and relations are perpetually revisable, then the mimetic world that is doesn't work within that context. And so, what I do in the rest of the paper is try to articulate how it is that I understand this notion of dispositional powers in relationship to algorithms. And I think that at this point, I will read about a little bit of the paper. Is that okay if I read a little bit of the paper? I have until what time? It doesn't matter to me. I can stop now. I can stop.
It's 15 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. That's great. So the modality of power, I say, is neither sovereign nor intentional, but dispositional. In the contemporary condition that we're living in of algorithmic governance, we should not speak of the constraining powers of the algorithm or of their biases or even of their coercion, but of their dispositional powers. So what are dispositions and what are dispositional powers? Dispositional powers differ from direct causality of willful action because they are not intentional but tendentious. By this, I mean that dispositional powers are neither direct nor necessary. They incline us in the way that we tend towards a musical preference or an affection. If an ideological state apparatus, to use a classic example, has as its correlate the fiat of sovereign power or the state, then the dispositional powers of the algorithm have as their correlate the relational powers of the sentiments. A disposition in this respect is not something that works in isolation or by decree. It emerges out of an associational milieu of interactivity between entities. unlike the model of causal influence that characterizes the coercive powers of sovereignty, dispositional powers are multifaceted and undetermined forces akin to the activities of what Roman rhetoricians called ponere, which is the etymological root of dispositio in the classical system of rhetoric, and translated into the English verb to pose, which is the root of disposition, which is to say, to pose here and there, to arrange here and there. So at this point, I turn to some studies of the aesthetics of dispositional powers and suggest that to attend to the ponere of ornamentation and the aesthetics of ornament means attending to the dispositional powers that arrange, adjoin, and compose elements. The aesthetics of dispositional powers, in other words, doesn't rely on interpreting the sense of the objects, but on the partition of perceptibility and attentions that the ponere or the posing solicits. This is why the ornamental object, for instance, is not a vessel of meaning, since it can't be isolated in such a way as to affirm or confirm its expressive qualities. Rather, these objects tend to aspire to relations to which it tends to by virtue of their being arranged in a particular way. And this is why, to me, turning to Hume's and the sentimental accounts of the sentiments, especially something like sympathy, begins to be relevant as the basis of thinking about a critical orientation vis-a-vis algorithms, rather than representation as being the foundation of it. Something like sympathy, for instance, for Hume is an account of impersonal centripetal and centrifugal forces that are unrelated to human interest or will. The sentiments, in other words, are natural powers that generate intimacies of worlds, of peoples, and of times. They are not subjective feelings that a human body registers. Rather, these are tendential forces that join and disjoin bodies in various types of forms of collective belongings. There is no logic to the sympathies and to the sentiments. Now, what I will end with very quickly, because I do appreciate that this has been more of a descriptive and expository talk, but I'm more interested in getting the sense of whether you think I'm suggesting things that are on the right track, rather than whether I get the argument exactly right. But I think that this is, that this approach is going to be particularly important when we're dealing with the emergence, especially in the 1970s, of Bayesian statistics, as opposed to a kind of frequentist account of probability. What I find particularly interesting about Bayesian probability is it doesn't rely on the frequency of outcomes, but on the recursive adaptability of a hypothesis given the volume of data. Again, the fact that you're constantly adjusting and revising things. This is the condition in which I think is crucial to thinking about algorithms in relationship to critical thinking, right? Is that it's not a correction of that is, in a way in which something like symptomatic reading wants to correct the perception of something that is apparent. But it is a way of thinking that is consistently, recursively adapting both the hypothesis and therefore the output. In other words, what does critique look like in relationship to revisability? The Bayesian theorems allow us, what they allow us to do is convert the probability of the evidence, given the truth of this, and here I'm quoting Justin Joke's book on mathematics, to convert the probability of the evidence given the truth of the hypothesis into the probability of the hypothesis given the evidence. So it's a direct inversion of the types of thinkings that we're accustomed to in critical theory. And here because I need clarification on this, so I'll just, iterate something that an explanation that I find helpful. The traditional way of thinking about frequentism basically says the world is a certain way, but I don't know how it is. Further, I can't necessarily tell you how the world is just by collecting data, because data are always finite and noisy. So I'll use statistics to line up the alternative possibility and see which ones the data more or less rule out. The Bayesian account says, I don't know how the world is. All I have to go on is finite data, so I'll use statistics to infer something from those data about how probable different possible states of the world are. So it's not about the collecting data in order to have a recurring sort of amount of fund of experience that will tell me the likelihood of some outcome. Rather, what I'm doing is, since the data is finite, I'm going to use a series of calculations to infer what the data can tell me about a series of outcomes, a series of outputs, how the data can generate a series of outputs. The frequentist is certain about the world's existence and its data, but they are uncertain about what data can ultimately tell us about the world. The Bayesian is certain about the existence of data, but is also certain that no conclusions about the world can be made from data alone, because any hypothesis can be adjusted by introducing new data. And this is, to me, to sort of start thinking critique in relationship to empiricism is important, because that was exactly the sort of move that was introduced by the sentimental empiricist tradition that said, there are no fixed relations, and so the only relations that we can know are the ones that emerge out of the fund of experience that, is consistently being generated. And so that relations are constantly being adjusted in relationship to the experiences one has, right? So in the classic sort of, 18th century scenario, we are constantly evaluating each other on the basis of how we perform certain things. Do we satisfy the terms and condition of a promise? And therefore, it's not whether we're good people or not, right? Because we tell lies or what have you. No, it's what is our reputation, and what does that say about our character? And so, finally, I'll just leave it off here. What I think has happened today for living in a world of algorithmic sort of thinking is that, this is a very big sort of conclusion that has very little to do with what I've said, but I think it's really important to how we move forward, is that it's no longer possible for people like myself, that consider myself more of a humanist, obviously, within the tradition of political theory and critical thinking, to move forward individually on this. We really do need to start to think about even humanistic and critical thinking in terms of a collective project, because the level of movement and expertise, et cetera, going forward are such that I certainly, can't make certain kinds of assessments and claims without having the collaboration of a whole series of people. And so I think it's really, the venues like this, I think, are really, really important, not just to sort of, tell me whether I'm, talking crap, but more importantly, so that there's the possibility of interacting and really getting at not the specificity of the problems, but how it is that we can collectively begin to deal with the issues that emerge, right? So that, for instance, one of the things that I hope to avoid in my interactions with people in computer sciences and statistics is the answer that says, there's a problem here, there's an intellectual problem or a critical problem here, that, and the other. And the typical answer I get is, oh, I just have to adjust the parameters and of the equation, and then we'll fix it. It's like, no, that's not actually the nature of the problem. The nature of the problem is, how is it that we understand our relating to this technology in a world, rather than how is this exclusively a tool for the management of particular outcomes. And I think the more and more we do that, I mean, this is obviously a trivial point, but I think it's an important point for humanists, especially people like me, who is a humanist in a social science department that has inherited in the United States, mostly given the history of political science, a strict division between technical thinking and humanistic thinking, which is at this point to my very strong disadvantage in this regard. And so there's really a lot of need to have to begin to interact with people that I typically would not interact with, given the nature of my research, which is obviously more philosophical, theoretical, and historical, precisely because we're dealing with a massive kind of technical shift. That I hope that at least the very least that you'll be able to take away is that it's not a problem of new media, but it is really a problem of the transformation of subjectivity and quote unquote consciousness in relationship to the development of technical media that can't be reduced to a single substance or a single causal effect, like propaganda, influence, or however it is that we used to think about it. That's it. Thank you.
Wow. Amazing. Amazing. There's a lot.
It's a little too much.
And we have time for one question.
There's a question here as well that I have on the chat. So
let's give a priority
to the chat. Anne Manuel asks, can you talk about dispositional power and algorithmic thinking in relation to the term soft power as it is used by mainstream political science folks? I haven't been asked this question before, but I have a very dismissive account of soft power, which it doesn't seem to me that it's very different than what people used to call ideology. It's the ideological state apparatus rather than the repressive state. I don't understand soft power other than that. And I think that what I'm trying to say about dispositional power is that it doesn't operate in that way. It's a very different type of way of operating. Why? Again, because of this question that it doesn't work on constraint, on the limitations of freedoms, on domination. It's not a power of domination. Soft power remains an account of power and domination. In fact, most of the accounts of power in political science are basically versions of an account of domination. And I think that dispositional powers are not powers of domination. They're powers of adjusting relations, and they're more engineering type of powers than they are oppressive type of powers. Now, the thing is that I never would assume that you have to make, I guess should be obvious given my orientation, but I don't assume that there's a hard and strong distinctions to be made here, right? There's nothing that says that dispositional powers can't be combined with forms of domination, et cetera, right? But I don't think that algorithmic systems operate on the basis of domination. I think that we do, but it's very different than and this is why I said at the beginning, I'm trying to think about it in terms of the kinds of challenges that people in the 19th century faces. Why people like Cavell and Benjamin, I go to them not to copy them, but to try to understand what they were challenged by, right? So that, if you know the history of photography, there is, a very famous case in France that emerged very quickly that made it so that photographic works actually counted for copyright. Why? Well, because the problem was that the laws of copyright in France after the revolution, relied on the capacity of humans to represent things, right? And that imaginative kind of mimetic kind of genius. And photography doesn't represent a reality. It's a machine that extracts an image. And so a lot of work needed to go into thinking about the photographer as somebody akin to an artist, right? But that, took several decades before you could get to that point. There were other questions.
Yeah, we have many. Barno, English, Sean, Robert, Chris, Max. Barno.
Okay, how much time do we have?
I leave tomorrow.
I have
Oh.
Answer whatever order as you wish. So the first question I have is about the dispositional power. I wondered what the relationship of dispositional power might be to a kind of Foucauldian conception of governmentality, which is also built on circulation and the arrangement of things rather than the more static territorial conception of sovereign power.
Yeah.
That's one. The second one is, you emphasize in your description of the sentiments, the impersonal and tendential forces of attraction and
separation,
repulsion, separation.
Yeah.
And I wonder what the role of interiority is in this account. Okay, they are not emotions, but are they entirely exterior forces in a kind of Spinoza's way, or how do you build in the interiority there? In other words, I'm interested in hearing more about how your model reconfigures a kind of classic agency versus structure understanding. And then finally, I'm really curious to hear more about rendering as it relates to mimesis, because when you went to this person doesn't exist, which is fascinating, I'd never seen that before. In a certain way, I wonder if the plausibility of the rendering is based on our expectations of mimesis.
Yeah, of course. That part for sure.
Rendering and mimesis, when without the mimetic conception, it's just it doesn't have the impact
that is well, and that's at the heart. I mean, so I'll start with that very quickly. That's at the heart of the question, right? I want the sort of utopian side of the project wants to say that there is a way of thinking critically about rendering that isn't reducible to mimesis, and that it is our habits of mind that make it so that the distinction between, or that moment of surprise, right, that one experiences when you're told that these people don't exist, right, is that is coming from our mimetic habits, but that there are other kinds of opportunities there. I mean, each of your questions hits on exactly the main points of the project. So So part of the project wants to say that there is a critical, that, wants to explore the possibility of a critical tradition that isn't exclusively mimetic, right? And so the question is, how do we begin to approach that, right? And how do we begin to approach the idea of organization of perceptibilities, right? Let me just use the language, this position of perceptibilities as opposed to the perception of truth and falsity, right? The perception of reality, right? Because I think that that's very much, obviously a very Rancierian type of project, as is not surprising, as you know. But I think that that's, to me, the sort of the core kind of question. And so the relationship between rendering and mimesis, I would have to think about it a lot more, because I haven't thought about them in relationship to themselves. I've thought about them as two separate kinds of things, and I haven't reached the point where right now I'm trying to articulate the relational the rendering and show how how it is different from mimesis. But I think that the relationship between the rendering and mimesis is one in which the rendering insists on the having to reconstruct the terms and conditions in and through which mimesis can operate. Right? So it's way too abstract. Here's a version of how I think, I think that this might work. So I don't disagree with the climate deniers, right? Not because I believe what they have to say or that I think that climate isn't an issue, right? But because the problem there is a system of education that has brought us to the point where we need a certain type of frequentist evidence to demonstrate the truth of climate change. The possibility of climate change as being a reality relies on a series of other parameters that render models of possible outcomes, right? In order to accept climate change as a reality, as a possible probable reality, we have to step away from the idea that demonstration in science is verifiable. That's the only way we're going to be able to make, and most of us accept that, but most of us exist in a universe that is very extracted from the, and the same thing with viral contagion, as we saw with COVID, right? What was the challenge to viral contagion? It was the idea that it was probable, right? And so how do you demonstrate how to act in relationship to something that is probable, rather than, especially in a country like this one, which, as my former advisor baptized in Christian capitalism, you still live in a deterministic world that requires a certain kind of evidence, whether physical evidence or spiritual evidence. And I think that, like, the problems that are emerging in, and you see this also in the, the ridiculous kinds of these ridiculous sort of congressional hearings on social media. And it's like, you're just not getting it, right? It's who can, this is like not Tipper Gore's world anymore, where you can put a sticker on something and it's and you warn parents that it's bad, right? Not the least. What's that? TikTok and, the stuff that happened a few weeks ago. And I was just watching this and I was just like, oh my God, we're so much trouble, right? Because if the only thing you can do is try to legislate use, then you're so screwed, right? Because then you go into this rabbit hole of, okay, well, do banks have to stop? Right? Because all of this stuff is happening and it's giving us security protections in our use of credit cards and our use of digital data, right? So why are you attacking social media when the biggest users of this type of technology are banks, right? I mean, you can't legislate it at the level of free speech. It's, or as I would say, at the level of mimetic representation, which is effectively what, free speech legislation is dealing with. I mean, there are other questions, but we can talk about it. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to start with a funny question that's basically mine, which is about the person that does not exist. So let me run this by you. I had this conversation with Starling, which is the image generated ChatGPT, right? So I upload the image of my friend and I say, portray this person in a dress. And Darby says, no, we cannot do that because we need to respect the image right of this person. Therefore, you cannot do that. Mm-hmm. And then I wrote back and I say, well, then how do you know this person exists, right? And Darby says, because you uploaded the photo. Well, the question is, then if you generate image, the AI image, and that person doesn't look like someone I know, how do you know this person does not exist?
Yeah.
Right? And for that question to throw to Darby cannot search the entire image of the world to find out the person does not exist, and therefore I do not violate any people's right by changing their image.
Yeah.
So, in terms of this position of power, I wonder how you would like to interpret this episode.
Well, I mean, I haven't done it, but I'm assuming that, because of certain kinds of pressures, where there's been a filter put in that says any image that's uploaded, it cannot alter it, because, you don't have the proprietary rights to that image. Now, we can talk about the question of proprietary rights to the image, because that, we all just lived through it, but in Los Angeles, we especially lived through it because that was the whole point of the Screen Actors Guild strike that just happened, right? Which is to me, a very interesting sort of development. We've never been in a world in which one had to make a claim towards the right of their image as a copyright, right? This is a fundamentally different kind of situation now, right? Ever since at least at a general level, ever since the Paul Walker posthumous appearance in one of the Fast and Furious movies, that it was a CGI rendered sort of image of him after he had died, right? We have never had to be in a situation in which you had to make the kinds of estate claims about the inheritance of rights to an image, et cetera. So I think that that's probably what's happening, right, in that sort of situation. But I think that your question is absolutely the right one and the wrong one at the same time. In the sense, but in the sense that when you ask, like, how does it know, right? The kinds of ways in which we deal with legislation, and this is the point about the difference between a rendering and a mimetic orientation. Ask, how does it know, right? You have to put a filter into that system in order to be able to operate as if we lived in the world of how does it know, right? Because I'm assuming that without that filter, it would do exactly, what you would have asked it to, right? Because a system of rendering doesn't need to have an accurate representation of the world, doesn't need to know the world in order to operate as it does.
Can I get a direct question?
Yeah.
So that was actually something that Melanie and I were talking about, like just using ChatGPT-4 with the DALL-E function to analyze images and things like that. So basically, it's like what he is saying is correct, is that you have to hard code, there are hard coded elements in the ChatGPT to prevent people being like, how do I build a nuclear bomb, or and then I was at this conference that Adobe held at Stanford in December. It's basically about how do you prove that the image is real, just from I work on an app that is trying to do that. But there was a lot of talk about deepfake porn, for example. And so it's it's interesting because a lot of people when they think about deepfakes, they think about people faking news or faking Trump, but it's 96% of the deepfakes out there are actually deepfake porn, which just opens up this whole thing about just consent, of just how do you legislate that? And it's a lot of it is high school teenagers, it's just a random 15-year-old guy on 4chan or boy on 4chan doing something. So but it's interesting because there is with explainable AI, which is what I focus on, it's we do want to be able to kind of illuminate what are the constraints for a large language model, but also it's there's this kind of tension between well, as a user you want to know what the constraints are, but then also if you know what the constraints are, you will try to push it so that you can get around those constraints. So there's always this thing of well, we want it to be explainable, so we know how it knows, which I think is very important. And at the same time, for certain situations of deepfake porn or things that could lead to violence, you also don't want to there is an incentive to not make it so explainable that you can figure out how to undo the constraints that exist. Yeah.
Sean.
Yeah, thank you. It was a very interesting talk. I think this is important stuff to think about. But I think we've stuck on something, which is maybe you can talk me out of this thing that I'm stuck on. I'm curious how you respond to this. But so like when you're talking about hypothesis and data, and throughout your presentation, it seems to me part of what's at stake is the replacement of deductive reasoning socially with inductive reasoning, right? And part of this depends on, it seems to me, the legacy of Hume, insofar as Hume is really the one who's most responsible, at least I think, for separating is from ought, right? So I'm taking from Alistair McIntyre that this actually doesn't work. If I tell you Max is a good carpenter, then that doesn't mean anything unless Max actually does carpenter things, right? Like he's like to say that he's a carpenter is to say what he ought to be doing, right? So, so if that's right, then it seems to me that there's also a problem because the kind of grid along which something like AI works, you know, the ones and zeros, the kinds of language that it uses and so on and so forth, already performs the function of, you know, limiting things in certain ways so that there is an odd distinction isn't perfectly clear. I think this is just a natural part of language, right? And so when you say something like sympathies have no logics, but they create belonging, then you get an ought from an is, it seems to me, but that already depends on an ought. And so I guess what I'm curious about is, you know, and this relates to some of the other questions that I think have been asked in certainly, but like these impersonal forces, the relationship between mimesis and I don't remember what the other one was, but it seems to me that it's more complicated in a certain way. So when you say that you don't want to go back to Kant, that's Hume. I'm curious about like what you get from that, because it seems to me that for Kant, these are the stakes, right? That we've lost some of our collective ability to think about the ought as it relates to what we are, right? Whereas for Hume, this separation is part of what allows this trajectory along the line of inductive reasoning instead of deductive reasoning. And so I just wonder how you think about that.
Well, because, I mean, very crudely put, I find that the Kantian move towards, you know, to the legislative move in Kant is not going to be particularly helpful within a context of things consistently being arranged and rearranged, right? So, you know, the reason why I turn to Hume is because he gives us a way of thinking about our relationship to the world as not determined by the conditions in which we exist, right? But by determined on the base, not determined at all, but as emergent from the experiences that occur, right? And these experiences are not reducible to the conditions in the conditions of our existence. And it seems to me that you know, it's this turn toward, and it's not a question of the ought versus the is. That's one element of Hume that, you know, obviously is significant. But, you know, it's only if we understand that carpenter is determined by X, Y, and Z activities that McIntyre's position is actually plausible, right? But we can equally sort of say that carpenter, you know, can change and all sorts of things. But that's sort of besides the point. I'm not that interested in the ought versus the is problem in Hume, but I am much more interested in the fact that in Hume introduces, or the sentimental empiricist tradition more generally, introduces the possibility that, you know, that relations are not determined by the things that they are relating. That's the move that really matters to me, right? That is related to the ought versus the is sort of thing. So it ought to be the case that women remain at home, right, and operate in domestic spheres, and that women be mothers and wives and not academics or what have you, right? Is one version of the problem, and then Hume introduces the idea, but that ought has no relationship to the way things need to be, and certainly there's no relationship, there's no way of justifying that on the basis of anything other than a series of habits and repetitions, right? The more relevant thing to me, though, from the Humean tradition is not the ought versus the is, but the fact that any perception or any belief in an is revisable. And in other words, the sociality. This goes back to Banu's question about the relationship between dispositionality and governmentality. I mean, obviously, I'm coming from that tradition, right? And it seems to me that one of the things that what Foucault sort of pointed us to, I have my own sort of, intellectual genealogy fantasy of what happened in Foucault. Like Foucault didn't, the French, if you look at the sort of curriculum of French education, in the Agrégation, there was no access to Bentham, there was no access to Mill, there was no access to the utilitarians, right? They just were not, and so he stumbles on this, and it's just like, oh, that's what society is all about, a system of judgments and valuations, right, that are consistently being arranged and rearranged on the basis of interactions. And that's effectively what I'm trying to get at here, is that, if we continue of thinking, we have now a very sophisticated system in and through which values are constantly being generated and regenerated, right? And so it seems to me very difficult to be able to rely on the critical theory response, the turn away response that says this ought not to be the case, right? This shouldn't be the case. That to me is the Kantian response. I don't think that's just going to work at all. Not the least of which because all they have to do, all that has to happen is, look at what happened in Myanmar. Right? We can put in all of the sort of protections we want of censorship on social media sites in this country, right? But look at what Facebook did in Myanmar. That has absolutely no purchase on the this ought not to be the case. And so I'm hoping that to avoid things like Myanmar in the future, we need to have a different type of way of thinking critically about these operations than the sort of local legislative sovereigntist approach.
Robert.
Thank you. Wow, I mean, this is really wonderful, and it's just so refreshing and important to have somebody bring these kinds of questions, because it's something that in our daily lives as instructors and as citizens, it's something that we're kind of more proud of, but don't really have the grammar for. I
should say that, I mean, I apologize for doing this, but your book on dispossession is part of what got me thinking about these sorts of things in this way, which is to say that, like, every mimetic claim is related to if you study the history of media, the possibility of a medium operating mimetically relies on copyright and property, right? And so Robert's work on dispossession made me sort of think about, okay, well, we are living in a world in which not within the context in which you're talking about, but disposability and dispossession are operating simultaneously. Anyway, go on.
My question was that, so on the one hand, there's something very new in a lot of what you had to say, new for me at least, and there was a sense of newness repeatedly referenced in it, that we're in a new era,
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, there was the overall structure of the talk. I found there's something rather familiar about it in a way that I wonder if there's a bit of a tension internal. So there's a way of reading what you're saying that it's a story of an incongruity or a non-correspondence between a theory, which is indebted to a story about mimetic representation, to the story of kind of domination as constraint, to substance and matter distinctions. You told a little bit of a story that there's this picture that holds us captive.
Mm-hmm.
There's a non-correspondence or an incongruity between the picture and reality. I want you to say maybe a little bit more about the source and nature of this incongruity. Because as you spoke, I kind of had a few different versions of it in my head that popped up. When you began, because of the reference specifically to algorithms, I thought the story was something like the mimetic representational structure works for some things, but not for other things. It was designed, for instance, for the human brain and traditional media, but then there's this other thing called an algorithm, which doesn't work like that. So it is true of its case, but not true of this other case. A different story you told was more of a historical transition. There was an era in which this was the case, but we are no longer in that era. So the non-correspondence is that this theory has lingered on well past its use. In other words, Aristotle was right and Hume was also right, but for different eras or epochs. There's a historical kind of narrative, and that comes up a lot in the that's now outdated kind of references. That it once was true, but is no longer true.
Right.
But a third thing is that it was never true. Reality was never like that, but we have this picture and act as if it is the case, in which case the source of our problems is not the algorithm, but the fact that we portray it falsely.
Right.
And we may then disabuse the picture of it, right? In which case there's nothing to the differentia specifica of an algorithm.
Right.
It was never true. Aristotle was always wrong. But then that's a different story about the incongruity between a picture and reality.
Right.
That makes a very different kind of account and a very different kind of critical thought.
So I don't think that I'll be able to, in this project, adequately satisfy the sort of, the really, it's fundamental sort of element of the question that you're asking, in part because I want to say it's a mix of these sorts of things, right? Part of the way in which I want to address, or the way in which I will address that question, whether it's a metaphysical problem or an ontological problem, a historical problem, or I can't remember the first one, how I would characterize it, is the way that I've begun to do this in relation. This is why I say, I begin, as thinking about Cavell, and Miriam Hansen is another, all the people I talk about in the film book that I've got coming out. Simondon, Gilbert Simondon, that I'm interested in articulating the political ontologies of a technical medium that are necessarily related to the emergence of those media. So it's both, historical and ontological. It's not that Aristotle always got it wrong, but in relationship to a particular medium, that in question, these operations of critical thinking work. When the conditions and parameters and the technical capacities of a medium shift, right, of a technical object shift, then you find yourself in the political ontology is substantially different. What I do think is problematic, and this, Max and I were talking about this earlier, which is like my sort of constant spiel. What I do think is problematic that we do get wrong is the Aristotelian claim that media are substances. That I do think is a mistake. That there is a kind of, the famous example of clay and mold as a way of explaining form and matter, right? That I do think is it's the best that Aristotle could do. He did a great job with it, right? But effectively, we don't need a theory of substances in order to be able to have an account of mediatic operations, right? That I do think is what I want to desperately get away from. This is why I tend to turn toward the Simondonian account, Gilbert Simondon's account, which begins with his critique of hylomorphism and then expands into a theoretical account of technical objects in terms of their associational milieu, not in terms of the specificity of the object. So that's to get at the sort of question, but one question. But to get at the historical point, I think it's important, and this is something that I'm just going to keep doing from now on in my work, because it has, as Max sort of pointed out, I began to sort of, try to articulate the importance of aesthetics to political judgment and political reflection. And as I kept going, I obviously, in my research, I obviously started to pay attention to people who worked in the domain of aesthetics and realized that really what the modern tradition of aesthetic criticism, as diverse as it is, requires is an interrogation of the capacities of a technical medium, its limits, and how an artist pushes beyond those. That's modernism, effectively, right? And we are living, like it or not, we continue to live in the condition of that kind of aesthetic and modernist condition, for good or bad. And so I realized that in order to be interested in aesthetics, I had always been interested in technical media, but there isn't, at least in my discipline, there isn't a political theory that's interested in technical media. At best, as we know, language is the medium of politics, right? But that's a very general kind of assumption, right? And we can't say with this stuff that language is the medium of politics, is the takeaway. Probability is the medium of governance now, right? And that has very little to do with language, or it has something to do with language, obviously. And so what I think is really, really important, at least for me as a political theorist, is if we're going to make a whole series of claims about bias, about constraint, about all these sorts of things that worry us normatively about living in democratic societies, we have to start thinking with media. And we have to start thinking with media as technical objects beyond our assumptions that these are tools of domination. And that's the sort of thrust, the big thrust of the project that all three of your things, the point to my confusions are getting at, because, I can draw from the tradition of cultural criticism. I can draw from the French tradition of, ideology critique or whatever. But we don't really have an account of political theory in relationship to technical media that really interrogates the nature of the book, the folio as opposed to the treatise, et cetera, et cetera. Political theorists tend to operate at the level of communication and accept the sort of 1930s to 1950s account of communication as language as communication as the exchange of information and the making of arguments. And I just don't think that that's sufficient in terms of what it is that we're dealing with in this context. So it's not an answer, but it's like, you're hitting the nail on the head in terms of the ambitions of the project and how it is that I'm trying to sort of introduce from, my interest in aesthetics and the history of criticism, trying to introduce a whole series of interrogations into the possibilities and limits and constraints of technical media and their operations as a way of developing critical political theory.
I guess just to is the alternative account, whether it's the mimetic tradition, is that like a rival theory that you're critiquing, or is it the object? It's itself a kind of assemblage or arrangement. So it is the object of study as much as it is an alternative account of objects. Yeah. The moving between those is both really interesting because it's kind of both, but sometimes hard to track when it's one or the other.
Well, and
is it false or is it?
Is
it not that the point is not that it's false? It's that it does a certain work.
It does a certain work, but it's inadequate to the other sort of operations that are in place in the assemblage, if you will. Right. And so this is why I'm sort of trying to very artificially introduce this notion of dispositional powers to really try to understand it's not about fixing you in a particular orientation, ideological, it's not an influence machine, as Victor Tosk famously sort of described it. It is about the constant arrangement of moving parts. And that to me seems like something that a critical tradition rooted in mimesis can't deal with adequately.
Yeah, you go first.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, because no, I was.
Yes, you were.
Yeah, I'm not cheating. Yeah. Okay, I think Davide, you offered an alternative tradition of critical theory, one of the many things you are doing. So if the dominant one, say, goes from Hume to Kant to Hegel to Marx, then to Frankfurt. So basically, you are suggesting on your move is that you go back to Hume and you start a kind of a new trajectory of a possible critical theory tradition
that is not epistemic.
That is not epistemic.
That is sentimental and not epistemic.
Sentimental, yeah. I think when.
So it would go Hume, Austen, Jane Austen,
yeah,
William James.
Yeah.
No, but I'm serious. I mean,
because this is a kind of a piece of a dialogue conversation that we can have later. What I'm doing is I also go back, not to you.
Mm-hmm.
I go back to Kant, then I make a turn, I go to Fichte, then go to the Romantic, and from the Romantic I find Benjamin.
Mm-hmm.
And they get similar things.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they get relationality, connectivity instead of
because they're 19th century. Because they're 19th. They're living in the 19th century.
They live in the 19th century, and they were aware that we cannot master reality.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this is the thing that is coming back. This is my real starting point for my question. So in a certain way, there is nothing really entirely new in the awareness that we don't or we cannot master reality.
No.
It happened already.
Yeah.
And when this thing happened, when we are aware of that impossibility, philosophy and theory react in different ways.
And for this story, again, thinking about Robert's work, for my story, it also includes the fact that we realized we couldn't master reality the moment in which we invented insurance companies.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because insurance companies allowed us a protection from risk through actuarial calculations that protected us from the fact that we could no longer control reality or master reality through prayer or through domination.
Yeah.
In the sovereign,
because of your emphasis on probability.
Yeah.
Yes, I totally get it.
Okay, sorry,
no, it's fine. Okay, I like the dialogue. Then I have a couple of questions related to this impossibility to master reality. So on the one hand, I would say again, it happened, in the German Romantics. They say that, and they made a similar move against the emphasis of a way of thinking based on purpose, ponere, and from a political legal perspective, they attacked positive law. That is another form of positive law means law. Positive law means law that is posed by the state. It is posed by the state to master reality. What they have done at the time, what they did at the time is no, we need a different understanding of laws, more dynamic, able to revise itself, adjust itself, and so on. That was a kind of a tradition of customary law for them, and against the imposition of state's law. Okay, the point is, this is my question. What is different between their time when this kind of awareness emerged and today. So if there is a kind of a recurrent emergence of the awareness that we cannot master reality, okay, what is the difference between 19th century and today's awareness that we don't master reality? And I think from what you say, the starting point is this new technology, in the sense that we can, in a certain way, master the impossibility to master reality. So in a way that it doesn't mean that we can intensify mastery, it means that we can finally learn how to collectively, your term, deal with this kind of instability on the basis of constant revising, adjusting, adapting, and probability instead of certainties, and so on. And what is available for us today is that technologies are doing this kind of a job. So in a certain way, we are in a time in which the same question is coming back. We don't master reality, is it possible? But we also have a kind of a new aesthetic and technologies to readdress this question.
I think that's right. In
a way that we need both. We need a perspective, where we want to go, but also we need to work with a kind of arsenal that we have in our past. For you, it's more human.
Yeah, it's more human.
For me, it's romantics and Benjamin.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I think, I mean, I think the major difference is the intensification. I think that whereas in the 19th century, various in Europe, various realities made it so that people can begin to appreciate that mastering reality was an impossibility. I think that now it's no longer a human problem, right? It's not something that, I mean, it's something that we, again, as you say, are recurring and reconfiguring. But I think that now we have an incredibly pervasive technical sort of system in the world, right? That makes our lives possible, and this is, I think, a biopower thing, makes our lives possible, makes the possibility of our having food possible, makes the possibility of our sewage systems possible, makes the possibility of our traffic systems possible, right? Premised on, it is no longer an intellectual problem, but it is very much a governance problem, not in the sense of government, but in the sense of the management of everyday life.
And I think the device, the machine we created in the 19th century, the state and legislation, are not longer able to master a globalized world.
No.
So this instability is so evident, and
Do we have time?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. This is extremely interesting. I'm not a political theorist, I'm a cognitive scientist. So I want to try to ask you not about the 19th century, but I want to ask you about the 20th century. So I wonder if you could say something about the role of probabilism, specifically in non-determinism. So you said something, but let me try to narrow my question. So I was thinking as you were talking, like the history of artificial intelligence and algorithmic thinking isn't probabilistic. That's actually, like, in the history of algorithmic thinking, very, very, very new.
Right.
So if you think about mathematics as an algorithmic system, this is like a real small blip from the Egyptians. And even in Bayesian reasoning, there are aspects of the model that you have to just sort of stipulate. You don't start from nothing.
No,
so there's a structure that's imposed in those. And so I wonder if you could say something about, because you say algorithm, but you need something more specific. So I'd like you to say what that is. And then, at the same time,
the same time that populism arose in like, I guess analysis of the natural world, like it infected cognitive science and it infected the theory of concepts. And so modern cognitive science is just rife with populism in the brain, like all over the place.
Yeah, of course.
And so I think about that in relation to your opening framing in terms of mimesis, because originally we thought that cognitive modeling was supposed to be mimetic.
Right. For mirror imaging.
Yeah, that's the representation that we care about, right?
Right.
And yet it looks like if cognitive science is right, that's probabilistic from the get-go.
Yeah.
And there's all of these ruptures, like cognitive illusions that we have are the version of large language model hallucinations, right?
Yeah.
Because there's a generative component to that.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you could say something about those two aspects and like whether, I think I was really struck. I wrote this down. You said the system of rendering doesn't need to know the world to render, and like that's true in some like very capacious sense. But since the job of these things is to render reality teleologically, that's why we care about them. I mean, we care about them because they're so good at representing reality. Right? They do need to know about.
Well, but yes, that I get. But they're actually not very good at representing reality. They're very good at providing us with outputs that satisfy our demands.
I totally agree.
Right. That's a different claim than a representation of reality that says that there's a correspondence, as Robert was sort of suggesting. Right. So that's what I'm.
Because it's arbitrary. Right? The fact that their job is to represent reality is something we're including.
Right, and because the operation of rendering is not one that sort of needs to look out into the world, but needs to have data. The question is data a representation of reality, or is it a statistic? Right, and that has always since the 19th century has always been a fundamental question. Here I'm thinking of like Lorraine Daston's work, et cetera, that the image of objectivity, and what I want to suggest again in terms of perhaps a difference between the 19th century and today is that we no longer rely on data as a representation of reality, right? It's merely a measurement between 2 points. Now, those 2 points can be two things that are real as we understand them in the world, right? But they could also be 2 points in terms of, when I click and purchase something on Amazon, right? And the algorithm, registers the click, right? It's also coordinating. Well, in fact, it's not coordinating, and I think that maybe this is the term that I didn't introduce, but that I think is part of the issues that I'm trying to think through. It's correlating.
Yeah, that's right.
Right? That's a correlation is different. The whole point of a correlation is that it undermines how traditionally we've understood the logic of mimesis. Right? A correlation is not a representation of reality. It's superimposition of points in space and time. Right? It's purely associationist. So this is why I say that, this is why, to me, somebody like Hume, because I'm just it's just my problem. But to me, I began with Deleuze and discovered Deleuze, this is like full confession, and discovered that, that Deleuze's, this is way back when, Deleuze's first book on Hume, and I just don't think he ever went away from that in some concrete way. But the point being that I think that how a correlation works as an association of terms that have no necessary, necessary principle of association, that is exactly anti-mimetic. Because the whole point of mimesis is that there's a necessary relationship between terms, right? That's why it works, right? As a representation of action classically in Aristotle. Now, it's, I think that there's a slight confusion because of, from my understanding, from my limited sort of research in cognitive science, there's a slight confusion in terms of how philosophers understand teleology and how cognitive sciences understand teleology, right? Because for you, an output is the telos, right? But it could be, there could be many outputs depending on the parameters, et cetera, et cetera. From a philosophical perspective, there can't be many outputs, right? In a teleological system, there's only one end, right? It's salvation, it's overcoming, it's the catharsis, et cetera, right? It's deterministic. So that, I think that's the difference. And I think that's, again, this is right, but I think that's what cybernetics introduced, the famous papers that cybernetics introduced in the 1940s and 50s, is that they redefined how we treat teleology. The famous Wiener paper on behavior and teleology, that, you look at it and it's like, yeah, teleology, except, the points, the endpoints are constantly shifting. Really, a feedback system is not a teleological system. It's a system of adjustment, negative feedback. It's a system of adjustment because it has to correct, because the endpoint is constantly shifting.
Yeah, I wonder if it's like teleology of two. The way I interpret Wiener's work is that it's shifting teleology from inside the head to characterizing the system as a whole. Right? So, like, from that standpoint, like, I don't know if there's any difference, I would think, between the cognitive systems that like underpin our understanding of concepts, let's say, from what you put into and like a recognition algorithm. They're sort of the same thing, right? So, like, we are also correlational engines, right? It's just,
but that's a very late definition of the human.
I know,
right? It's like, and it's a very. I want to say that's not an Aristotelian, mimetic, substantialist, Thomistic, legalistic, legal subject, Kantian definition of the human at all.
I think I'm answering Robert's question.
Yeah.
I think what I'm saying is, yeah, they were wrong. Yeah. Okay, I'll stop it.
Yeah. Do you have more people on the list?
I don't have, no, I saw Sean and
Jack.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. So one of the interesting things, but I thought it was interesting when you were talking about, like, is data a representation of a reality or a statistic? Because what I would argue is that data is an abstraction.
Yeah.
But so is so much of everything in our reality. So, like, I'm taking a linguistics class with one of somebody that Rana recommended, and just like thinking about, like, language is an abstraction of our thoughts. So, like, if you like, and so, like, I focus on like suicide prevention and kind of like thinking about ways of like how you would try to understand suicidal thoughts, but like suicidal, like you're thinking about like analyzing somebody's like diary, for example. The words that are put in there are not encapsulating all of suicidality for that person. Like, those are just like the few like distilled moments of being able to verbalize that feeling, but it's not actually like a suicidal thought. So like, but what I'm saying is that like that is an abstraction of what that person is experiencing, but at the same time, like that abstraction is also reality. Like that diary is reality as well.
Yeah, but I mean, again, it's thanks to what we I'm convinced that it's, this is not something that I can argue or suggest, but it seems to me, within the context of trying to think critically with media as opposed to against media, it seems to me that account of mental life is possible as a result of our having to, our having developed a whole series of technical MRI scans, et cetera, that give us a very different picture of what an abstraction is and its relationship to human action, human will, and those sorts of things. So I totally agree with you. But again, what I want to say is that we have a very new account of cognition, consciousness, and human subjectivity that we're going to have to deal with, and that the liberal account of the legal subject isn't able to take on. I mean, just think about how it is that, we treat recidivism as a probability. And that we begin to think of crime as a probability, right?
So it's interesting, like when you were talking about the Bayesian statistics stuff, for me, the part that I really like about Bayesian statistics is and kind of feel free to correct me if I'm messing this up, but it's like you can actually look at the formula. It's basically looking at all these conditional probabilities. So it's like the probability of A given B is the probability of B given A times the probability of A divided by
Yeah.
And so in that case, like the example I like to give is if you're thinking about probability in terms of the probability that a student will do well in math is going to be related to, the probability that a student will do, or the probability that a teacher will believe a student is good at math, given that student scores in math, is related to the probability of that student's score in math, given that their teacher believes that he do good at math.
Yeah.
Sorry, I forgot why I brought that up, but that was just when you brought up recidivism, it made me think of
Well, think of it, to me, I think it's important to think of it this way, is that machine of the state of the 19th century that gets invented happens in relationship to a particular account of human capacities, and within the perspective in which I'm looking at it, that is determined effectively by actuarial calculations, right? What you just described is very far from the actuarial account of value of human life that we developed in relationship and as a result of the emergence of the modern state. I mean, we are just very, very different creatures, it seems to me, in a Bayesian world than we were in an actuarial insurance world of risk. And I think that's the challenge. And what I want to suggest, that challenge is what I think that the mimetic tradition is limited by, mimetic critical tradition in the humanities and social sciences is limited by, and legal sciences is limited by, and I think we need to really start to think differently about it for our own good.
I think so when Panagia say that Aristotle and Kant they were wrong, thinking the subject in a certain way. I think that no, it's not about being generous with them or not. I think the question should be more self-reflexive. So they saw the war through very specific historical acts. And now we have to ask ourselves, why do we see the war through a new account of cognition and subjectivity? But it doesn't mean that the way we see the world through this new account of cognition is the entire world, because otherwise we go back into the paradigm.
No, of course. No.
And I think we still have a lot of mimetic representation of the world.
Oh no, absolutely. No.
Newtonian physics to write a bicycle. So
absolutely. The way that I think about, just to and this is something that as a side project I'm interested in looking at, and I know some feminist historians and some feminist scholars have looked at this, but we didn't have a way of verifying that fetuses were alive until you had sonograms. And it's interesting how intense the abortion debate became after we had a picture of a sonogram image. Despite the fact that I have a colleague in the history department, despite all of the experiments that the Catholic Church did in Mexico in the 19th century, with abortions and inducing abortions, et cetera, on unwed mothers, and trying to see if there was a soul inside the fetus. Yeah.
Well, just to come back to this, I mean, that was more the thrust of my point, was that to call this other account, to say this other account is false, is to reproduce exactly the thing you're trying to critique, because you fall back into the idea that there are pictures of the world that either correspond or do not correspond to the world as such.
No, that's right.
And once upon a time, people thought there was a correspondence like that, and now we're sophisticated, we know that they're not, because we know that reality is not a thing, it's rather a kind of probabilistic, dynamic, relational kind of, but we know that, and so our picture does correspond now to that.
Right, but this is
the fact
that but this is why
non-correspondent. So we fall completely back into that. Instead of asking the question not were they wrong, but rather what was the purpose to ask its function rather than its
what was the problem that it was trying to address? But for me, it's not a question of and for me, it's not a question of whether that picture is a good picture or a right picture, not a right picture. It really is a question of how do we think about the world when the conditions of the world are as in this way now, right? That's my question, and it's not a question of right or wrong. To me, the sort of mimetic tradition of critique is inadequate to the conditions in which we're living.
It's inadequate, but continues to be operative.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. No. It's still
its function is different now than it was.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
But it thinks itself as working.
Yeah.
That's the part of the problem.
Well, this is
that it is adequate, whereas what you're saying is that
I can't, I don't think that protesting against algorithms is the way to do it.
I think so. I just want to say that, all I was trying to say was that this is the problem that people in cognitive science have been facing for 70 years. So welcome to the club.
Yeah.
Right. So I think maybe these are making those issues vexing for everyone now, but it does challenge a lot of conceptions of the unity itself, the notion of agency, and no one has good solutions to them at all, right? And so we do default to these other approaches because they do have some purchase.
Well, but also within the world of political theory, I would say that there's also some very good reasons why we don't want to go there, right? It's very hard to give an account of human rights that isn't rooted in some kind of mimetic description of the world, right? And so when we're sort of seeing, when we're asking about the problems, the political types of problems that algorithms raise, I don't recognize these as human rights problems precisely because they're not violations on movement. Quite the opposite. Most of the accounts of human rights have to do with some notion of freedom to move about, freedom to think, freedom to move, blah, blah, blah. I don't see these as constraints of our movement, but in fact as the encouragement of mobility. Keep clicking, keep liking, keep doing this, keep doing that, right? Don't stop. And so, part of the tension is to sort of say, okay, this new sort of or different type of relational way of thinking about governance and personhood and all this sort of stuff and consciousness is emerging. What is that going to do to, our basically, Western liberal account of laws and rights-based subjectivity? I don't, maybe there is something within the Western tradition. I would suggest that there's probably other traditions that we need to incorporate into this, indigenous traditions, Buddhist traditions, et cetera, that aren't so centered on individual selfhood.
But this is also where theory stops. So because basically
these new technologies can go into the direction of what you call the position of power, but can also go into the direction of a position of power, and the state can take over, and then the new technologies are just a new device for controlling
and that happens.
So,
that happens with radio. That happens,
everything.
with everything, right? Because that's what.
Where theory stops.
Yeah,
That is a kind of is a field of risk and possibility.
Right.
Things can happen.
And I will say that I will go on the record. I would rather the state take control of these systems than fan corporations, because at least we have a tradition of dealing with the state. We don't know how to deal with these fan corporations. We have a history of contesting the state. We don't have a history of contesting fan corporations or corporations, and especially not in this country that they now have personhood. The gentleman in the back there kept asking questions. Go, raising his hand. Sorry.
Yeah, I think it seems to me that part of. I mean, I'm hearing different people seem to express some of the same concerns that I was trying to express before. I think it didn't work. But it seems to me that there's an issue of the tension that's necessary even to the statement to say that there's something that we have to do or something that we need to do, or that's something that we're
of course,
right? And so part of the point that I was trying to make is that, if that's the case, then you have to have, because part of what mimesis allows is the linguistic ability to negate, right? To be able to make distinctions and say what we ought to do and why, right? So in the same way that, I'm gonna stick to my guns here a little bit and say that Hume, by separating is and ought, obfuscates the fact that we are actually directed in certain ways. So in a certain way, this issue of the gap between correlation and representation, I think part of the issue there is an issue of scale, right? Because representation still does something. It doesn't matter. I don't know how much it matters that we always represent things inaccurately to some degree, so much as that it does have this performance function, right? That it allows us to do things.
Sure.
And so through our means to be able to construct ought along certain vectors, right? That is what both would allow us to follow you down some path to something better, which I'm all for sure, and I want to know how that goes, and this is what I'm curious about.
Yes,
but
so am I.
Also to Robert's point earlier, this is also something about the history of modernity, right? That there's the trajectory of the loss of the ability to negate, and that I don't think that one has to say that this is technologically determined. Whether or not it works the other way around, whether one wants to say, well, the logic of algorithms is just, one of many symptoms of this trajectory. I'm not going to wade into that. But my point is simply that what I'm hearing you say is that because of algorithmic logic, thinking in terms of negation on the basis of mimesis is inappropriate, but then I'm not sure what direction you go, because if you go to Hume, then I think you have the same flattening, right? How do you
well, but okay, so I see your point. So the thing that I like about Hume is that he doesn't reduce critique to negation, right? But like
you said, all clicks are affirmed.
Well, but also all unclickings are possible too. That's the thing that I like. Right. So the moment in which you separate terms from relationality, including the word critique from negation as an essential relation, then you can begin to start to think, how is it that I can enact critique in relationship to a system where no negation is effective, but can be just a system of revisability. I mean, you might not like that normatively.
I don't see it, but I'm interested. I want to know.
Right. But so basically think about, a Jane Austen novel. This is why I include Jane Austen in this trajectory, right? What is a Jane? There's no negation in a Jane Austen novel. There's, conflict, there's antagonisms, of course, but there's no negation in a Jane. There's a constantly having to perceive actions and imagine mental states and rearranging relations and adjusting for relations, for antipathies, sympathies, et cetera, et cetera.
We have 1 minute for the final comment because Robert, you have to say something really.
I was just going to add on to something that was said, a few minutes ago, that to me, the point about the incongruity between a certain depiction of the person as a unified, reified mind that seeks correspondence to its external world. The point of concern about that is not that it is false or true, but that its falseness is part of its productivity and purpose.
Yeah.
That the clearest expression of that is precisely the idea of legal personhood.
Yeah.
And the fact that we have a very hard time conceiving of resistance as something other than the assertion of rights is symptomatic of the flip side of that is that legal personhood is so central to the assigning of, say, criminal culpability. So that the concept of responsibility. So the point is that we act as if people are persons.
Yes.
Because that is extremely powerful fiction. And the fact that it's not true in no way
changes.
That actually makes it more powerful that it is not true. That because it's the incongruity between people as they actually are and their depiction as a legal fiction.
Right.
And in a kind of Greek context, maybe the dramatic persona of a chorus is the context within which the representational image of a person as a speaking kind of agent is operational. And then in the medieval context, like the personification of the state in the body of the king is that, well, in an early modern and liberal context, the legal person as this kind of fiction, that it is not true is what makes it so important and powerful. So just denouncing it as untrue has nothing to destabilize that function.
No, that's absolutely right.
To reveal how its operative function.
Yeah.
And so that to me is the puzzle, trying to both, it's not that it may be untrue, but that's not the relevant factor that we're trying to dislodge.
Right. That's right. No, I agree 100%.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.